You have 11 passenger trains, you have a large number of freights. You obviously can't run all this at once. You're in a situation where you're running over a 24-hour day, I take it. So you built a timetable and you set it all up basically to move all of this traffic over this 24-hour period. So in an operating session, how much of the day do you typically operate?
Planned for 8 hours, but typically about 6 hours.
Okay, so you get basically four sessions out of a complete run.
So it takes a long time to finish the day.
Yes.
You know, the through freights run at night. They run between 12 and 4 or 5 in the morning.
Right.
The locals run during the day.
Yes.
My New York Central passenger runs late afternoon to late evening, and again early morning to mid-morning.
So you tried to take the trains that were out there and match them to when they actually ran.
Yes.
Where did you get all of that information?
Well, there's a fellow named Terry Link who has a Canada Southern website, and it's a general New York Central website, but he has all of the timetables, all of the freight schedules, all of the local freight schedules, the Canada Southern employee timetables.
What the consists look like, that sort of thing.
Exactly. What kinds of, you know, what kinds of sleepers did they have on this specific train? When did it run? Where did it stop in Canada, for instance? There's one, the Detroiter, for instance, one of the 3 all-gray trains on the New York Central. So this is the very highest of quality. It stopped in Detroit, rang its bell as it went through Canada, and stopped in Buffalo. So had very little, so it ran at 80 miles an hour and just ate up the miles, 230 miles in about a 3-hour schedule. So we averaged over 70 miles an hour going through Canada. And that was with a crew change in St. Thomas. Typically, the other trains ran on 4-hour schedules, and there was a couple that took a long time because they stopped at every little town across the way. They were the local passenger service, so there'd be, you know, 2 or 3 people getting on in West Lorne, Ontario, 2 or 3 people in Comber. But twice a day there was a train that would stop and pick them up.
This sounds very detailed and thorough. I guess it would gravitate a lot of interest in terms of other people moving towards the New York Central because there is so much information available. I understand that there's even a sort of a society, a group of people that are interested in New York Central activity.
Well, there's the New York, I call it the New York Central Hysterical Society.
Yeah.
New York Central System is what it's called. I don't know how many members it has, but it's been operating since the New York Central essentially stopped operation in 1967, 68. And ex-employees started it, and so that's now 45 years it's been going.
So do they produce bulletins or magazines or that sort of thing?
A magazine. It's really been rejuvenated over the last 4 or 5 years with new people coming in and tilting it away from pictures of steam engines to how we can best preserve the memories of the New York Central by modeling the system. And the people that are coming into the society that they're trying to attract are people that never saw the New York Central in its heyday, or even in its later, in the late 60s. So it's been a real sea change in the emphasis. They still have the printed headlight, it's called, 4 times a year, and that tends to be more historically correct articles and pictures. There's a new digital magazine, and it's now had 5 or 6 editions, I guess, at least 4 times a year, that is much more how I modeled the NYC, how I modeled the NYC harbor operations in New York City, So, and you know, how I modified such and such an engine to look more like a New York Central engine. So much more geared to the modeling. So that has generated a lot of interest. We actually had our annual meeting in New York City last year because it was the 100th anniversary of Grand Central Terminal. And they had 250 people.
That's
that
nice.
Came from all across Canada and the United States. One fellow came from Denmark, another fellow came from Australia. And a crazy bunch of guys, you know, and their wives, kind of thing. It was going to New York City attracted a lot of
Well,
wives.
New York is being one, you know, a major hub of railroading, and in the 50s, the New York Central was a real big going concern. For you as a modeler, it must have produced a sort of an endless requirement to get locomotives and rolling stock.
Tell me. Well, the one joyful thing was there was a lot available.
Oh, that's good.
And
yeah.
it developed more and more, much less on the CPR side, although that's changing a bit now with Rapido in Canada. But there was, I mean,
if you wanted a passenger train of like the Broadway Limited or something, you could get that quite easily. Yeah.
And excuse me, the passenger equipment that the New York Central had was typically it was off the shelf. There was maybe one or two cars on a train that were very specific to that train. But most of them, the sleepers, were off-the-shelf sleepers. You know, they were buying in mass. They weren't buying specialized cars particularly.
And then freight cars, I guess, also was just incredible in terms of what was available. You could basically go out and look at.
Not so much.
Yeah,
there was
really.
Less. There was very little. The society wasn't interested in modelers, so it didn't engage with the manufacturers. And if the manufacturer wanted some, you know, drawings or something like this, I have the feeling that it was inaccessible somewhere. Right. It was packed in, you know, in containers, and nobody could find it. So the manufacturers soon learned there's not much point in going to the society. That's changed a huge amount. Over the last 5 years, there's been a lot of New York Central stuff that has come out that is specific to New York Central in conjunction with the Historical Society and encouraged by the Historical Society. True Line Trains in Canada is doing a New York Central caboose that should be out in the next 6 months or so.
That's exciting.
It is, you know. It's exciting. True Line Trains.
I still think in the you know, it's funny. I always say people were always saying the good old days of model railroading, but I don't know. It can't be any better than it is today.
Walthers in 2009 did the 20th century, which never came through Canada. But because the cars were standard, I could use them on the trains that came through Canada. So all of a sudden, that took my trains from 6-7 cars to 10 or 11 cars.
That's exciting.
And this, well, it makes it more difficult because now the staging and the reverse loops and all of those kinds of things have to be modified because the train is longer and longer.
With all of this rolling stock, I mean, a lot of, in larger railroads, which this one is, there's a requirement to manage all of this stuff. You know, for small model railroad, people use car cards and things like that for car forwarding. And the other interesting thing is a lot of the computerized versions of these car forwarding systems, they're typically oriented towards freight traffic. I heard that that you had sort of taken the bull by the horns and had a look at how you could apply freight car forwarding to the passenger situation and make it work. Can you tell me a little bit about the history of that?
You can't make it work.
You can't make it work. Why is that?
Well, I've been using a computerized system called ProTrak
Right.
for the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Before that, I was essentially doing handwritten switch lists and all this kind of
Sure.
thing, which worked just fine because I now knew how many trains I needed and what they could do and all this. However, at the end of a session, if there was too many cars in St. Thomas Yard, for instance, I could make up a new train and get them out of there.
Yeah.
And send them to industries and do this kind of thing. So it was only one level that I had.
Keep it going. Oh,
So we were talking a little bit about your operating car forwarding system that you're using. It was ProTrak, and that really there isn't a system out there that can accommodate the way passenger traffic works. Can you explain maybe what the difficulties were with that in terms of making that modification?
Well, essentially what I did was encourage the developer, a gentleman named Jim Moyer, who has been developing this system for 25 years or thereabouts. I met him at one of the OVAR dinners and happened to sit next to him and was looking for this kind of product. So he said, yes, my system will do everything. So I ended up buying it, and it always worked great on the freight side. But the passenger side was ill-developed, not ill-developed, undeveloped. And we started having ProTrak weekends where heavy-duty users would get together for 3 or 4 days and talk to Jim Moyer about what could be improved, where we were taking our railroads, what we needed in the future. He has been a developer who has listened to his users and has done the work to make the changes. Partly because he is building a big layout himself and he wants the functionality for his own layout. For instance, he wanted a ferry boat, so now we have a ferry boat function, or a car float function, which I'm using, going across the St. Clair River between Sarnia and the United States, Port Huron. So there's a very positive thing. About 4 years ago, he really started developing the passenger side, 4 or 5 years ago.
When I'm thinking about these car forwarding systems, so typically they're set up based on train length. Number one, they're based on the length of the sidings for dropping off and picking up cars. And so as a consequence, the randomization is another factor that comes in, where cars are randomly selected off of to be put on trains, to be put in sidings, or to be put in industries or be picked up. In passenger train service, everything is very specific in not as random in many ways.
Right.
You have specifically named cars that need to go on certain trains and need to be in a certain order and taken off at certain places and being replaced by others.
Yep.
That would be pretty difficult to build into a program that really is designed for specific random processes.
Well, I think what he essentially did was have 2 halves.
Yeah.
One being freight forwarding and one being passenger forwarding. Essentially, you don't want the 2 to overlap, because you certainly don't want your freight cars sitting in the middle of Detroit's terminal kind
No.
of thing. So it's really quite separate, and he's developed it differently. He's used, for instance, waybills that say what car goes from Chicago to Buffalo, kind of thing. And it's a very simplified kind of waybill. His freight waybills are quite complex, with a lot of flexibility and a lot of variability in them. The passenger side is simpler, but now he has been adding, for instance, the REA functions, the post office functions, what trackage you're going in on, the cars that are in the train. So when I do a waybill, I say this waybill is typical for this particular passenger train.
Okay.
So then I put essentially the waybill, you put it in the car, now the car follows what the waybill
So,
says.
say for example, if you had a specific coach that you built a waybill, that coach would typically be a through coach that would go from Chicago to New York or
Yes.
something like that.
Exactly.
Where you might have, for your, as you described earlier, your dining car needs to be pulled at Detroit on certain cars at certain times of day.
Yes, exactly.
And you
But
can
that
specify
dining car
that.
is on a specific train too.
Yes, so you can specify all those things,
Yes.
what train it's supposed to be on, where it is, I guess, on the train, and
Yep.
how it's
Yep.
to be taken off. Whether that's quite detailed.
It's
That's very nice to have that feature. Probably many people don't even know about that.
well, it's by far the best developed passenger car forwarding that I'm aware of. The Wolverine,
Yes,
coming out of Chicago in the late afternoon, has an observation car on it
right.
and a parlor car, because it's leaving Chicago at 4 or 5 in the afternoon and arriving in Detroit at 9 at night. So those cars get taken off in Detroit. That's for the parlor cars for business traffic,
Mm-hmm.
and the observation is because it's light out, and also for business traffic,
Sure.
and that kind of thing. So there's no need for those
Overnight,
two cars
yeah.
to go anywhere else, because the demand finishes
Yeah.
at 9 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock.
Folks are
at night.
getting on in Chicago and getting off in Detroit, and that's it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So and then the next morning when the Wolverine arrives back from New York City, it's again the same traffic. It arrives in Detroit at 7 o'clock, so it can get into Chicago by about 11 or 12. So it's the same parlor car and the same observation that get put back on the car, on that train going out of Detroit. So all of that is possible, and it's fairly easy to set up. I've worked closely with Jim because there's always glitches. And what worked for 1 or 2 trains, when you have, I think, 27 passenger movements on my layout during a 24-hour period, it doesn't always work the way he thinks it's going to work. So there's been a good relationship. Plus there's other people, there's a fellow named Andy Keeney in Lansing, Michigan,
Mm-hmm.
who is developing a big passenger operation as well. So there's people on the side. There's a fellow outside St. Louis who's doing St. Louis terminal. So all of these people are there saying, here's what I need. And when, for instance, there's an email group for this. So when they see my problems and my issues, they say, get this sorted out. I need to, that's what I want to do too. So, Jim, please, give John a hand on this.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been a good relationship.
Right.
And he does the improvements. There's no other system that I'm aware of that does the improvements. A lot of times the poor developer packs it in after 7-8 years because it's pretty tough game.
It's intense.
It's a tough game.
Yeah. Just on the other side of your layout here, it's an interesting one because you've incorporated a helix, and that really allows you to extend the usable space in your basement to generate a larger railroad. Hopefully, as we go through the layout, you can we'll go and have a look at it from spot to spot, and you can describe what you've done and how you've extended the distances by using helix. And I think it's something that people have thought about often, but they really haven't incorporated it into a layout.
The one thing I like about the helix, I mean, as you say, it certainly expands the usable space. If I'd have known how it was, I would have had a third level. I have a friend, the fellow in Grand Rapids, he's got 4 layers.
Wow.
4 levels. Now each one gets narrower and narrower as you go up.
Sure.
And but you think, wow, I thought I was fantastic doing 2 levels, let alone 4 levels. The hobby has developed, kind of thing. But the one thing about the helix is I have 5 routes that go through that helix. So one is the New York Central through route, one is CPR trains that go up the Chatham and across the Toronto on their main line, and there's 3 CNO routes, Chesapeake and Ohio routes, that go in and off the helix at different levels, which then give you a lot of different possibilities for the kinds of trains you run.
Oh, that's fantastic. So, do you think we should go and have a look at your railroad?
For sure.
Let's do that then.
Okay.